Thank you so much, Meghna, for joining us on what is the first edition of this podcast between the Bastion and Esya.
Thank you for having me.
For the viewers, Meghna is a tech lawyer and also a technology policy researcher and consultant. She's currently working with Esya, but has a wealth of experience with emerging media and technology. And today we've sort of had the privilege of having her on board to talk about the state of surveillance in India. And this is just off the back of a report that Meghna's co-authored called Bridging the Transparency Gap, along with Spandana from also Esya. The idea behind this conversation, of course, is that this year has seen, like most other recent years, lots of conversation around surveillance, privacy, how it impacts the lay citizen as such, and the onset of the Personal Data Protection Bill, amongst many other tech and privacy bills, means that it's important to be able to distill what surveillance and privacy and these sort of buzzwords mean to everyday users of the internet and regular citizens of the Indian state. So with that, I'd like to sort of get started with this conversation and talk to you about the general state of surveillance in India. You have the regular and obvious forms of surveillance in the forms of CCTV cameras. Delhi, for example, has more CCTV cameras than any city in India. Hyderabad too, I believe. And you've also got them in airports and in most public spaces in our metropolitans. And then you have the more insidious kind of surveillance systems in the form of spyware, with Pegasus being the most recent unraveling, if you will. Can you give us a general state of surveillance in India and the government's involvement in all of this?
So I can't speak to the exact levers that are being used by the government because obviously all of that is pretty hush-hush, but I can talk about the frameworks surrounding it. And by extension, we can understand the dimensions of access that and power that the government has to carry out surveillance, right? So the primary framework that gives the government surveillance powers in India is the Indian Telegraph Act, which was brought in by the British in 1885 to give them easier access to build telegraphs on private land. Essentially, it allows them to access any message, intercept any message, or take over any telegraph in cases of public emergency. And we've seen instances of this act being abused, in fact, as early as 1991, and even before that. For instance, in 1991, the CBI carried out an investigation founded on a complaint by Chandrasekhar, who was a prominent Indian politician at the time. And it revealed that, the administration had tapped the phones of at least 50 politicians and tampered with physical mail. A few years later, it was revealed that through the course of the 1980s, both central and state governments had sanctioned the tapping of several politicians' phones. And then this prompted a civil society organization called the People's Union of Civil Liberties to file a writ before the Supreme Court, challenging the constitutionality of the provision in the Act that gives the government these wide interception powers. And the court brought in certain safeguards, that a committee has to be formed, that the Home Secretary has to sign off on every surveillance, every order for surveillance. But essentially, these were supposed to be these were then turned into the telegraph rules, and these were supposed to be a stopgap measure because it's highly executive led. So there's no other branch of government that really has any involvement or oversight or check against, the executive use of surveillance power or deployment of surveillance power. And the interesting thing is that the concept of, or at least the British notion of surveillance, which we see in the Indian Telegraph Act, emanates from this Benthamite idea known as the panopticon, which was essentially conceived by Jeremy Bentham, who's a jurist and a legal philosopher. And the panopticon is a central sort of watchtower in a prison that is shaped, that is the shape of a circle. And essentially, the notion was that if you're watching people all the time and they know that you're watching them, they'll behave better. Or at least this was for prisoners. This was a design for prisoners, essentially.
Where has that brought us to when we look at the state of surveillance in India today? You mentioned that phone tapping. In fact, phone tapping has always been a feature of Indian politics, let's say. But with something like Pegasus, but particularly, but also with regular forms of surveilling citizens and users of the internet, very often the surveilled isn't necessarily a politician or someone particularly in the same space of competition. Very often they are citizens, opposition leaders. You have cases of now sitting judges that have been revealed to or allegedly are being surveilled. How does that shift the onus or relevance of privacy and the right to privacy, shall we say, for regular citizens?
Right. So I think we need to kind of separate some considerations of privacy from surveillance, right? Surveillance does have some important security
Necessity,
dimensions.
yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, it is in some senses very necessary. But generally, at least in other countries, what I've seen is that there are some safeguards that are put in place to ensure that there is trust and not widespread surveillance. That being the case, in the US, the security agencies have been pushing for backdoors into all encrypted messaging channels for a very long time. And essentially, the notion is that the biggest problem with backdoors and ensuring access is that rather than increasing, or yeah, the paradox is that rather than increasing security, it makes communications more vulnerable to malign actors.
Interception, right?
So essentially, because backdoors work in a way that you can't ensure that only the people you want to enter can enter, then anyone has access to it. So you essentially are creating a vulnerability in your ecosystem, which leaves everyone a little less safe. So that is, I think, the primary consideration when you're pushing for widespread surveillance. That being said, one can kind of empathize with the impetus because generally you are also dealing with an unseen, unknown, um,
Enemy, shall we say? Yeah.
not enemy, but whatever. You're dealing with many unknown unknowns or known unknowns, and you have to there is then this impetus to try and account for as much of that as possible, or try to head that off as much as possible.
You hear this all the time in India, right? If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to worry about. Uh, on the note of dealing with the unknowns, what do you have to say about this trope of having nothing to hide and so privacy isn't shouldn't really be a concern?
I think that generally speaking, if you look at any information or if you look at communication as a construct, I think that context is a very important aspect of that. Understanding communications and the context that they are situated in is then can then create some room for some kind of, I guess, not contradiction with that statement, but definitely, yeah, some kind of trouble
Right.
if a message is taken in the wrong context, etc., etc., which can be the case. So
Is it
yeah,
also a case of a slippery slope in terms of setting precedent and uh, not knowing what the future may hold vis-a-vis the tech world?
look, the precedent is already set, right? We've had an act in place for what, over 100 years, that gives really, really wide powers. And so you know, you can talk all about, oh, there's this form of surveillance, or this thing has been used, or that thing that has been used. What it really comes down to is that if the frameworks undergirding that ecosystem support it, then there's nothing that you can really contend with the actors that are, just kind of moving along with what the frameworks support or enable. So you have to look to the frameworks really, not to the actors so much that are, working on what they have available to them.
Right. And as a lawyer, what is the status quo that you've seen in terms of the legal or the change to the legal frameworks underpinning this enabling effect with governments and citizens' privacy?
Well, I guess the primary gap in India in terms of surveillance is the transparency around surveillance, right? Not only are Well, a lot of large tech companies do carry out some pretty heavy reporting or transparency reporting, but Indian companies have started, so that's a positive element as well. But for instance, telecom companies, they cannot report any requests for surveillance of our data under the telegraph rules because it has to be kept confidential. Same with the IT Act, requests or information about requests have to be kept confidential. That's not to say that you can't say the number of requests that you have, because that I think is a gray area. So if there really was an impetus to publish some information, they could. And I know that ShareChat brought out a transparency report. And I think that as this becomes an increasingly relevant concern in India, we'll see more transparency around this and more pushes for transparency around this. But essentially, yeah, I think the gap is that there is no oversight of the way surveillance is carried out.
Let's move this from a legal.
I'd say limited oversight. Yeah.
Right. No, sorry. I was just going to move it from. I know I asked you the previous question as a lawyer, but you spoke about context and relevance of privacy. There are 5 states. I mean, like states going to elections in the coming year, and nowhere do you really see privacy being a relevant pole position or something that even citizens are demanding for. It speaks to a larger sort of relevance of privacy to a certain audience and set of people. And I know you have some thoughts on this, besides from being a lawyer. Just as someone who's worked in technology policy and as a research and consultant, how do you see the relevance of privacy varying across India's vast demography of voters vis-a-vis being an election blank?
So it's interesting. I think that from the time I started looking at this, privacy has definitely become a more important concern. And I think what speaks to that is the reaction to WhatsApp's decision to change its privacy policy. And then you see just like this boost in Telegram subscribership because people are concerned about, snooping on their messages, etc., etc. So I think that it has gained a lot of momentum. I don't know in terms of grassroots how far that
is privacy an elite concern right now?
Sorry?
Privacy is an elite concern.
I don't know if privacy is an elite concern. I would say that I don't think it's percolated deep enough within the polity for it to be like a mainstream political concern. It is to some extent. I don't know if there are bigger issues or smaller issues. And I'm not going to make any value judgment to that effect. But I do think that generally you can see political action kind of dictates what is and what is not a priority. So for the polity at large, not to say that there aren't vast numbers of people who are really concerned about their privacy, and not to say that it doesn't affect everyone. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. But what I'm saying is that it doesn't seem like it's gained critical mass to
Yeah.
be completely politically relevant
No, that's
at
fair.
this
That's
stage.
fair. On that notion of like gaining critical mass, the paper that I referred to, right, bridging the transparency gap. Of course, that's a comparative between the surveillance mechanisms and governance in India and the US. But the paper specifically talks about how requests for data localization came about in the wake of the Snowden leaks, and you've done some research on the kinds of activism that has initiated conversation around privacy. What do you think? I mean, and you also mentioned just now that it's increased since you've been in the space, right? What do you put that down to in terms of activism, citizens awareness, particular, the RTI, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there are a lot of people who have, worked really hard to create a groundswell around this and have done really good work. And I think that it is just more general awareness about this. And I mean, obviously, no one wants anyone, in their business. And people, I think, at an individual level, do care about their privacy. But yeah, so I think it is just more awareness, information has obviously percolated to a larger sphere over time. And I think it's only set to increase as time wears on. You can see now with a lot of ads now for messaging apps kind of focus on privacy in India,
Right.
that messages
Yeah,
are encrypted and everything. So I
for
mean,
sure.
that kind of gives you an idea of the temperature and where it's at.
The most topical no, question around privacy right now is the spyware, right? The whole Pegasus controversy. And the SC has also mandated a separate committee to investigate and put out a report headed by an ex Supreme Court judge. Now, if you're saying that Pegasus in many ways is a manifestation of the acts and legal framework that is in place and has been in place in India for a long time, um, do you see this being a common occurrence with governments and ruling dispensations moving forward? Is there a way to enforce or ensure that these things don't happen in the future? And the concern is, like I said before, widespread. Right? It's not just politicians being snooped on; it's journalists, it's your opposition leaders. Uh, the notion is that it could be anyone. What's your take on the whole Pegasus, Prakash?
I can't really speak to, whether this is going to be an enduring trend in the future or anything like
Mm-hmm.
that. But I do think that we need some modicum of safeguards, and that is also, I think, in terms of geopolitical strategy, it's maybe the smarter thing to do,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of nations are now rallying around ideological lines of democracy, etc., etc. At the same time, the US, which is the country kind of leading this effort and calling this rallying call around all of this, essentially, you are going to see more multilateral and bilateral frameworks with which call for safeguards around surveillance, data, etc., etc. So it is possibly in our interest to kind of um, in a strategic way, in our strategic interest, to bring in some safeguards. And there have been efforts to that effect. The IT rules talk about transparency around consumer complaints, that you have to publish a report with them, etc., etc. So I think that, yeah, as this gains critical mass, as it becomes perhaps a more important geopolitical issue, we'll see, hopefully, the induction of more safeguards around surveillance and
And it's
push.
not just geopolitical, right, Meghna? The other aspect or incentive mechanism for a democratically elected government to sort of protect citizen privacy, would business interests be one of them? How does the state of surveillance in a country affect its ability to attract investment and enterprise? And would that also be fit into this whole incentive mechanism moving forward?
Well, yeah, I mean, so the geopolitical element is also mercantile in some sense as well, right? Because it's generally trade agreements that will kind of be dictating this. Lots of
What about
agreements,
private actors as well?
for instance. Yeah, so they would be affected by this, but also, you have things like adequacy agreements, which will ask for a certain modicum of privacy or like an equivalent amount of privacy for
Right.
companies that operate in this country that are maybe dealing with citizens' data in another jurisdiction. So you have, yeah, there is a business imperative for this as well. Because if you want to operate globally, you have to be able to ensure that you're giving a certain, you meet the strictures of privacy legislation in other jurisdictions,
Right.
certain other jurisdictions.
I mean, this is the last few things that I want to talk to you about. But I noticed in the report that you mentioned transparency reporting as something that was really important in democracies to both engage private investment in capital, but also on an international relations scale. What does said transparency reporting entail, and where does the push and pull for that come from?
Right, so I think I've spoken to this to some extent. Transparency reporting essentially entails giving data on government surveillance requests, on takedown requests. So Google, Facebook, they have yearly transparency reports that they issue. So it's kind of in line with those. Problem in India is one, there are some confidentiality clauses within legislation, but there are many workarounds as well, like Section 91, for instance, under the CRPC. It doesn't, I mean, it's a basically data, you can make data requests under it.
Right.
Or you can make requests to companies for any requirement of any data under for any court hearing broadly. So, Section 91 doesn't have any confidentiality strictures, so you could publish data around that. But there are like multiple acts under which, for instance, sex determination. So if there's anything related to sex determination, you have to take it down, but you can't disclose any information around it. So there are some different, I guess, impediments within laws that, and some which are couched in cultural sensitivities.
Right.
But all in all, there is scope, and like I said, ShareChat brought out a transparency report. So I don't think that there's anything stopping companies in India from doing that on a more regular and large scale basis
Right.
if they want to.
Okay, that's fair. Okay, I just want to sort of wrap things up and look ahead at both. There's a parliament session on where there's going to be a DNA technology bill that's going to be introduced and discussed and debated upon. There's a personal data protection bill. There's non-personal data that's also relevant from a legislative perspective. The long story short is that privacy concerns aren't going anywhere, and that legislation on this is going to hopefully be changing and trying to keep up to the pace of technological developments and keep up with civil liberties. What is the tech policy researcher and consultant's take on the future for surveillance in India and citizens' privacy on that front.
Yeah, I would say that we've only got room for improvement. So I think that things will get better as time progresses and as
Yeah,
people continue to kind of create awareness. And also, I think an important dimension of that is to really signal why privacy is important, not that say that, oh, privacy is a right and we must have it, but what is the value of privacy to, the common man, to everyone? Why or how are they affected by it? Um, there's a author and legal philosopher, Michael Sandel. He talks about in his critique of liberalism. He says that the problem with liberalism is that it speaks to the value of rights within themselves. So a right has value because it is a right, not and doesn't really speak to the virtues of
right,
why it is good. So why is freedom of speech important? What is the relevance of it? It's not enough to contend that, oh, it is my right and that is why it is important, but you have to really signal the relevance of these things in order for them to kind of percolate into streams of consciousness that are separate or maybe a little disconnected from your own.
absolutely,
Um,
absolutely.
so I think from that perspective, the better people are able to do that, I the more it'll take root. And I think that companies are definitely wising up to the fact that the Indian consumer is becoming more aware around this and is more concerned about their privacy, about the privacy of their communications, and as that takes hold, eventually we should see some kind of improvement over time.
Right. And yeah, I guess, like you said, it comes down to all of us as media people, as researchers and analysts, to simplify the language around technology, privacy, and sort of show the manifestations of these rights in our everyday um, ways of living. And hopefully, the time isn't far
Yeah,
for
just
making.
I guess virtue signaling.
Yeah, right, right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Meghna. This has been great to catch up with you and also learn from the perspective of someone who's been in the space for very long. I think as media people also, we spend a lot of time reporting and very little time actually going into the depths of the history of privacy and surveillance, but also the reasons for its lack of relevance to many parts of our polity and society. And so on that front, it's been really great talking to you. Thanks for taking time.